started. Bob Tyler, who's joining me, will be in a few minutes. And what we're going to do is divide and conquer these bullet points. And if at any time anyone has questions, feel free to raise your hand. I'm going to first start with the second one, the Johnson Amendment and political activities. Bob was going to cover the first one, so we'll have him cover that when he gets back. But for those of you who don't know, just a brief background of the Johnson Amendment. In 1954, there was a tax code that was passed that prevented nonprofit entities from endorsing political candidates. And it threatened to take away the nonprofit status if you do so. Before 1954, there was a long-standing history and tradition of pastors freely being able to speak from the pulpit on biblical issues concerning politics and moral and social issues. And then once the Johnson Amendment passed, it almost was just pastors started becoming afraid that if they were to speak negatively about a particular candidate or endorse a candidate, that they would lose their tax-exempt status. And currently, you have President Donald Trump, who has promised to repeal the Johnson Amendment. Unfortunately, though, the president does not have that constitutional authority. The Johnson Amendment was passed by Congress in 1954, and so it takes an act of Congress to repeal that. So President Trump signed an executive order in 2017, basically directing the Treasury Department not to enforce the Johnson Amendment, and so that churches can, just to take away a little bit of that fear that that will be enforced. And to give you an idea, it's basically a toothless amendment, and as an attorney, I can confidently say that because there's only been one church in the history of the Johnson Amendment that's ever lost its tax-exempt status. And that church, what they did was placed a 2-page ad in 2 major newspapers going against a presidential candidate, President Clinton. And so they, by posting those advertisements saying, you know, don't vote for President Clinton, they lost their status. But besides that, there has been no church that has had their status revoked, and you have pastors all over the country inviting candidates to speak in their churches and just being bold and speaking out, and that hasn't been a problem. And churches can freely, another bullet point is what can pastors do? Do they have a right of free speech in the pulpit? And so we'll address that as well. But churches can freely speak about moral and social issues without endorsing a particular candidate. You can say where a candidate stands on the issues such as abortion. What does the Bible say? And what are these candidates running for office? Or what are these elected officials, what are they doing? Are they acting in alignment with that? Or are they acting against that? So when it comes to biblical issues, you are free to speak. Yes, you have a question?
Just a quick one. Can nonprofit status ever get reinstated? Can you get beyond that and become nonprofit again, or do you have to reform somehow?
So your nonprofit status is revoked, and you can apply for it again. So it's not a permanent, that you're done forever and you're due. Yeah.
What happens if, say, you endorse a candidate and a year or 2 years later they're in office and somebody doesn't like, finds a clip from your church or whatever, can they still prosecute you then?
Yeah, so there's a statute of limitations, and it's generally 2 years. It depends on the particular conduct, but it's generally 2 years. But it really takes, like the one case that I cited, a 2-page newspaper ad in 2 major newspapers. You can have a candidate come speak. You can have even multiple candidates come speak at your church and just introduce themselves. They can read a scripture. It would take something as extreme as putting in ads in big newspapers or a TV commercial from your church, which you know, you shouldn't be doing that anyways, probably, as a church, but you can invite them to speak. You can tell your congregants, or I know not everyone in here is a pastor. You can tell other staff members, whatever, about their positions on certain issues. And the topic, you know, today is all about trends and where's the trend going. And this is the one area where the trend is in our favor, in the favor of religious freedom, because although President Trump hasn't been able to accomplish what he's wanted yet, he's still pushing forward and working hard to get that accomplished. And there are congressional members who are trying to put laws in place to amend the tax code. And so this trend is favorable, and just that executive order, because it is the feds that enforce the tax code, and then you have the leader, you know, the top executive, President Trump, saying, don't enforce it, you know, be very lenient on churches. So even before President Trump, it was a toothless amendment, and now with President Trump leading the Treasury Department, it's even more. The odds are in our favor. Churches have more likelihood of getting hit by lightning or a fire caused in their building by faulty wires than they would be in trouble with the IRS. But I know that kind of stuff doesn't keep pastors up at night. It's really the threat of their tax status being removed. I have a little bit of cold, so bear with me.
The Equality Act right now in the Congress, if it passed, of course they're gonna add the LGBTQ as one of the Title VII rights there. Once it's passed, I don't know how it's gonna affect the Christian community. Would the Christian community be exempt from that? You know, like some of the cases that happened in California.
Yeah, so you're jumping, which we can,
Yeah.
I know you might have to leave early, so the last bullet point will same-sex marriage affects your ministry operations. And so with that, the answer to your question is currently, yes, that churches are exempt. When it comes to a biblical issue such as marriage, churches have the right under the First Amendment to practice their religion, and if, you know, the Bible does say marriage is between a man and a woman. So when it comes to that, you can't be prosecuted for, say, you know, not marrying a, you know, failing to marry a same-sex couple in your church, although you perform weddings for heterosexual couples. So you wouldn't be in trouble for something like that. As long as it is within the ministry, so your faculty staff that are performing ministry operations, such as teaching biblical principles, even just at a religious school, even a preschool, you have the right to hire teachers that are Christian and to make sure that they comply with the Bible and biblical faith, even by requiring them to sign a statement of faith. Where it gets a little dicey is something such as a janitor, someone not performing ministerial functions, a janitor who comes at night to clean a school. You can't discriminate based on their sexual orientation. You're subject to similar laws as everyone else, but you have full protection when it comes to ministry operations, when it comes to what you require of your church members or students of your religious schools. That's covered. And another area where it gets dicey is if you are acting more as a business and not as a religious organization. So for example, there is a case in New Jersey where a Christian couple purchased a beachfront property. And their goal was to honor God with their property, to have Bible studies there and worship, but it was not a church, it was more of a retreat center. And they were allowing weddings, private weddings to come in, and, you know, they were charging a fee, even though they were, excuse me, even though they were a nonprofit, they were operating more as a business, and it was not a church or a school. And so the New Jersey Civil Rights Commission stepped in because this couple wasn't allowing homosexual couples to get married at their facility. And the New Jersey Civil Rights Commission fined them. And so Alliance Defending Freedom filed a lawsuit, and unfortunately the court agreed that this retreat center was more like a public institution and less like a church or a religious school. And so you want to be careful if you are acting as a business and more on the financial end, that you are consistent in your policies. If you're allowing, you know, couples and you don't require them to have a particular faith, you're allowing heterosexual couples to get married and to rent out a facility, then you should be consistent, and you can't discriminate when you're acting more as a business and as a public entity.
How far does the reach back? Meaning, say for instance, you're an Anglican minister and you have a member whose siblings, or one of the siblings is gonna get married and they wanna do it off-site. And you find out that there are two females, and you say, okay, I can't marry you.
So as a minister, you don't have to marry anyone. It's up to you. So it's more when you're just allowing, if you had a property that you allowed people to rent for, to get married, you would have to allow them if it was an off-church property. But you don't have to marry anyone that's against your religious tenets.
You don't
So
need
even if it's off-site.
Even if it's, I'm more thinking
Yeah.
about the off-site business.
Right, no, you are completely protected in that area.
Okay, yeah, even then, if, say you were, doing weddings that were not from within your church, but I mean, you actually, did like side work, so to speak, where you were doing weddings, for the general public, still the same thing applies.
Yes, if you have policies in place that, you have, you only marry Christians, for example,
Okay.
or they have to do this premarital counseling. But if you are, there are two atheists and, you don't ask them any questions, but as long as they're heterosexual, you marry them, and it's not a religious ceremony, it's just a civil ceremony, then that would be discriminatory.
Oh, okay.
If you say just because you're two females, I'm not going to marry you. But if you're marrying people under the covenant of God, and that's the power and authority that you're marrying them under, then you don't have to do it. But if you are holding yourself out as a minister to other people, and it doesn't matter when you have to, you'll be treated more like a public official and not as a minister.
I have a question about going back to your statement about the non-ministerial staff and not being able to hold them, or potentially not being able to hold them to a statement of faith. I mean, we're a Christian school in Temecula, independent, and we require all of our employees to sign a statement of faith, and I guess our position is that they're interacting with the parents, and so part of our mission is to deliver the word to the parents too. So is that
Right.
okay?
That
Or
is
is that
okay.
the part that's under?
No, if it's part of your statement of faith, they're interacting with parents, and that you have your consistent policy that you're dealing with, and it's your mission and goal, then then you are okay to do that.
Even if they're campus services or IT or any type of function.
As long as they are, like you said, ministers to the community, to your students and parents, then yeah. Okay.
Now, how closely do those need to be spelled out in writing, in policy forms and so forth?
Well, the more that it is spelled out and detailed in your policy, then the more protections that you have to where you can point out that in our bylaws, you know, we define marriage, or we define, you know, what you have to believe, then you're more protected. Because it's all about consistency and to show that you are not discriminating against a particular individual, but this is part of your faith, it's part of your organization, it's how you treat everyone. And so the more that you've crossed your T's, dotted your I's, and it's in those bylaws, then the more protected you are. Yeah, so if you don't have those, then you definitely, it should all be in your bylaws and your school policies written out. You want to be safe. Because when it comes to issues such as sexual orientation and transgender, these gender identity issues, the trend is to eliminate gender and male and female, and to push, you know, the state legislator wants to evolve, help everyone evolve, and so that's where it's going. And so what we can do right now is make sure that we have our bylaws in line, our policies, and use those religious protections as much as we can. Okay, Bob, do you want to go over the non-discrimination and public accommodation laws first?
Sure,
Okay.
sure, I can address that. So the non-discrimination public accommodation laws are something that are, for private business, it's absolutely imperative that you understand what they are. For ministries and churches, it is less applicable to you, arguably. Here's the bottom line. All of these laws that say you may not discriminate against individuals based upon their race, religion, color, creed, sexual orientation, gender, etc., generally, across the states, and it's fairly unanimous, all of those laws apply to businesses. The federal rule is similar. You cannot discriminate against race, religion, color, creed, disability, but it does not include sexual orientation and gender issues. There is something called the Equality Act, which is being pushed in Congress right now to be passed to modify, I believe it's to modify Title VII, the Civil Rights Act, which is essentially the federal version of the non-discrimination law, and to include sexual orientation and gender. So, at this point in time, from a state perspective, the non-discrimination laws apply to businesses. From a federal perspective, they apply to businesses. There's a specific exemption for religious organizations on the federal level. On the state level, the term business is defined so that it does not include churches and religious organizations. However, it's about the code in California where it's actually enforced. It says something to this effect. Non-profit religious organizations who have their 501c3 status are exempt from these non-discrimination laws. Okay? Religious, non-profit, 501c3. So we had a case where we defended a church preschool. They did not have their 501c3, and they were for-profit. We still won. And we won based upon legal precedent, which lots of folks said, oh, you're going to lose. But we said, no, this is what the Constitution protects us, regardless of what the state says. We won that case. It was a discrimination lawsuit brought. So non-discrimination laws basically are relevant to the church in this way. It's relevant to you. Most of you are 501c3s. Most of you are religious corporations. But what happens when you have a cafe, you run a little bookstore, you run some other things that are ancillary to the ministry. You run a ministry on the streets of Hemet for youth, and you bring them in. And then one day, someone comes along and says, wait a minute, I should be allowed to be hired, for example, the street ministry you guys have. You guys, I don't know if you still do, you had a like skateboard park, right? Still have a skateboard. So you know, you've got some pro-female, transgender individual who says, hey, I want to come give, you know, I want to apply for the job that you have open to manage the skate park. Like, well, sorry, you have to be a Christian, and you're not a Christian. She files a lawsuit against you, and then the big question that comes up is, running a skate park, is that the same as running a church? Is it a business? They'll question, is there a fee for kids to come in? No fee. Perfect. Not for profit. But in some cases, churches will have something like that where, yeah, we're going to have a skate night, and it's you got to pay a fee to come. I'll give you a better example that may be even more applicable for churches. What happens if you have a couples retreat? And that couples retreat, you charge $150 for people to show up, to spend 2 nights at okay, that's pretty cheap. It's $500 to go out to the desert, 2 nights in a hotel, 3 days of teaching. You're paying for the speakers, you're paying for food, and you put this on, and Lord willing, you cover all of your expenses, maybe make a little bit of money to put into the fund for next year. And on top of that, you're selling books at, you know, wedding book, you know, the church and or the speakers are selling books. So then the question is, someone says, hey, we're a transgendered couple, we're a same-sex couple, we should be allowed to come to your marriage retreat. And you're operating this, it looks more like a business than it looks like a ministry. So that's where you wind up with what we're going to see into the future are questions about whether the church looks more like a church or does it look more like a business. The more you stray away from what appears to be a business, the more it looks like you might potentially have liability under these new laws. This Federal Equality Act, no exemption for churches. That's why it's a big deal right now, and there's a lot of folks stepping up and coming against it. I'll give you one more example on the accommodations laws. When you hear about accommodations law, again, just pretty much they're non-discrimination laws. You can't discriminate. Where I see this playing out sometimes in this case that just came in, I wish I could remember, I can't even remember who it was, where it was, what city, but I know the facts. That's. Do you trust my facts when I tell you that?
Sure, Bob, you're a lawyer.
I'll make them. I'm gonna go like, guys, gotta make some up. I can't. The funny thing is, I was telling somebody else this story like yesterday, and I'm like, I can't remember who it was, where it was, who it was. I'm talking, but here's the facts. So, someone has the city asked to use their church to be able to hold a city function. It might have been in like the fellowship hall or something like that. The city wants to use their church. And the church is, absolutely. The city says, we'll pay you money to use your church. What happens if you rent your facility out to a secular organization? And then the Boy Scouts come along and say, hey, we'd like to rent your facility. And then the Girl Scouts. And then Equality California comes and says, we want to do a rally to support LGBT issues. We want to rent your church out. Then they sue. Hey, you rent to everybody else. You're doing this as a profit. That looks more like a business. So my recommendation to this person, I can't remember in the city, I don't remember and where this, when, and any of this that happened, my recommendation was, if I remember right, was that you don't rent it out, just allow them to use it for free. Donate it. So that's one way you try to get around it. But California, you know, we are on the cutting edge of everything. Every LGBT concern, every non-discrimination concern, all of it, we're on the cutting edge. We're targets. So that's the issues there.
Okay.
What's the next one you want to
Church
address?
discipline of individuals.
Yes. Okay, so now this is the tough question. So much, again, what we're talking about here is the scope of this is constitutional law, right? What are your rights as churches? The culture in the crosshairs, with the church in the crosshairs of culture, and these laws that are coming along. So how in the world do you deal with individuals? I trust all of you look at the Word of God here, and I think I know enough of you to see, and or the denominations you're from, that you believe the Word of God is the Word of God. And so when the Scripture talks about not having adultery, and someone continues in that sin, that as a church, if you have a membership, you're not going to want that person to continue to vote as a member in your church. Or maybe you don't have a membership, maybe it's a Calvary Chapel style where it's a fellowship and it's an association. But what's the Scripture say when someone's in sin and they've been confronted and you go through the steps? Eventually it is, I call it disbarment because I'm a lawyer. Excommunication. Yeah. Happens. And so then the big question is, oh gosh, I've had churches who have said, I'm going to shy away. I don't want to deal with it. We're not going to excommunicate them. Okay. I've had other ones say, well, you know what what we really want to do? We really want them to keep coming to church. Okay, that's your prerogative, but more often than not, they really don't want them there. And so how do you deal with church discipline and still stay within the confines of law, not be sued, et cetera, et cetera? Well, it becomes even more difficult from a constitutional perspective if the person's engaged in a same-sex lifestyle. You know, we're dealing with these issues today. Sexual issues are difficult. What's the difference between a person engaging in a heterosexual affair, an adultery, and a single individual engaged in a same-sex lifestyle? Engaged in the lifestyle, not someone who just says, I'm struggling with this, but someone who's engaged in it. What's the difference? From a sin perspective, not much. I don't think. From a cultural perspective, there's a big difference. Why is there a big difference? Because to my knowledge, there is no national association of adulterers seeking to promote their civil rights, to be adulterers, and to be accepted for who they are, and not be treated any differently. For adulterers, it's easier to come to them and say, look, sorry, you're in sin, this is against God's will, and you cannot continue participating in our fellowship, even that we've gone through the steps, and you're no longer a member, and that's easier. But when you come to someone who's engaged in the same-sex lifestyle, and you've done everything you can and love and everything you can to try to do it the right way, and they still refuse, and it's time for you feeling like I either have to ask them to no longer come to the church, or I need to excommunicate them from the fellowship. Then when you do that, you're going to have to be very cautious that when you don't treat people differently, you do the same to an adulterer that you would do to a same-sex individual as you would do to others. Some people, I've had this happen a lot, where they're like, well, some people get special treatment. They kind of overlook this individual, but they don't overlook this one. They overlook the heterosexual sins, but they don't overlook the same-sex sins. Let me say something real quickly. From a spiritual perspective, I was arguing the same-sex marriage case in San Francisco when the mayor was issuing the same-sex marriage license. All these people are coming together, and it was chaotic. And I'm standing there in the center of City Hall, waiting. I walk over to the elevator. I'm standing there. I'm looking around. I see there's 5 or 6 same-sex weddings going on all around me. At that point in time, I was alone. I was escorted by some sheriff deputies to get in there. It was pretty chaotic, and I was, kind of the target for a lot of those folks who didn't like me. And so we'd just come out of court, and so just lots of emotional stuff. But I'm standing there, and I see these 2 gals getting married, and when I saw them, I looked at them, and I thought, wow, they don't, they just look normal. They're They're not dressed in white wedding dresses. They were dressed in just pretty blue dresses. Young gals in their early 20s, it looked like, maybe mid-20s. A couple little blonde boys standing next to them, some family members probably, 2 or 3, and then, you know, a reverend standing in the middle, and they're smiling. Yes, they're so happy. Now, granted, I had come through people who were screaming at me because of who I was. I had people, you know, shirts off and crazy, and, you know, it was weird. And then you walk in, you see, man, that person could be my grandpa. That person could be my grandma. And you know, just normal people, and you're looking at them, they're in line to get married in a same-sex wedding. I'm looking at these gals, and I see how normal they look, and they're just smiling. I thought to myself, they could be the girl next door kind of thing. And I felt the Lord impress upon me so clearly right at that time. So clearly. I grieved for their souls. And tears came to my eyes. I was, you know, hoping that you know, oh my gosh, it was really tough. Spiritually and just seeing that. But that's kind of, I think, how God needs us to see these individuals, that, you know, God grieves for their souls, and so should we. Yet, God tells us how to deal with sin. And so when you're dealing with church discipline, always my recommendations, of course, especially in dealing with the same-sex issues, deal it with love. Know God cares for their soul. God grieves for their soul. And make sure you don't treat that sin necessarily different than other sins. But realize the potential that that's a sin, that there's a national organization of individuals who have lawyers, who have lots of money, who do want to come after us as the church. And they want to sue us. They want to come to you and say that your cafe or your bookstore should be treated like a business. Your facility, your camp that you rent up in the mountains, you know, maybe you have a, you know, maybe your church or your denomination has a camp and you rent it out to a third party. They want to come after you, so you've got to be wise, real wise in dealing with those issues. And you want to have real effective policies if you do ever rent your church out. If you rent facilities out, you want to have a good facilities use policy. Talks about the facility may only be used for such and such purposes furthering the kingdom of God, etc., based on your definitions. Have the people sign statements of faith that intend to rent.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to take the next two. So the first one is sex ed in public schools. I'm sure many of you have already heard about this. So in 2016, the California legislature passed the Healthy Youth Act. And what that did was mandate that at least once in middle school and once in high school, that we teach sex ed in public schools. And not only that, but we cover gender identity in an affirming way, and we teach about different genders. We affirm different sexual orientations. When we have examples of a male and female, we also have an example of 2 males, 2 females. And this led to the California Department of Education Health Framework, which was just passed May 8th of this year, which is a few days ago. And what the Department of Education did is they put these recommendations of how do we actually teach this, and their guidelines for public schools. And I'm telling you, this framework is obscene, it's pornographic, I mean, I couldn't even stand up here and say some of the things that are in there. But these are recommendations, and local districts have the control to, they still have to teach about gender identity and sexual orientations and affirm those, but they don't have to follow the Department of Education's framework. But this framework is in place for the next 10 years. And it starts in kindergarten, where they're teaching children that there are 10 different genders, and you can pick, you can be both, you can be none, you can change, it's gender fluidity and the gender spectrum. And so that framework is in place for the next 10 years. And basically what's happening is parents have to choose to either subject their children to this, or protect their innocence and having to pay for a private school or homeschool. And so that's where we're at today. And tonight I'm actually hosting a forum at Reliance Church to inform parents, pastors about what's going on what the curriculum is locally in Marietta, Temecula, and what their options are with private schools, with homeschool, and things like that. And churches are getting involved, ministers are getting involved to help inform their parents about this and what their options are. But it is alarming where we're headed with public schools and what they're subjecting our children to. And I can let you
Can I
cover.
interject?
Yes,
Okay, go ahead and sit down for a second. I'm gonna give you some of the disgusting stuff.
thank you.
If you haven't heard, that one of the sex acts, apparently it's a sex act, I'd never heard of it before, but it's tongue to anus. They're teaching this. They are teaching how to do that safely. Yeah.
Safely.
Yes, they are, and I've seen the curriculum, Netta's got it, she's more knowledgeable about some of the stuff. But what I personally read was where one of the curriculum that's been approved by the state is kids can explore with cucumbers and just make sure you use a condom with a cucumber. Use bananas, make sure you keep the peel on. This is, I mean, this is literally, I'm telling you, this is what it says. Terry, for Linfield, I don't know if you know about what's happening at Reliance.
Yeah, we're gonna be there tonight.
Okay, good. Because this is critical. Our Christian schools need to be, honestly, need to be standing out, talking about this stuff. I will say one thing real quick, and I'm gonna get on just a little bit of the soapbox on this. One of what I believe is our greatest problem in society today, in the Christian world, is the fact that we, the church, our kids, we are getting our theology on all of the cultural issues from CNN, Fox News, and the public schools.
Yeah.
Because when it comes to addressing LGBT issues, or abortion, or taxes, or role of government, or immigration, you name the issue, a lot of our churches and a lot of the pastors will say, we are just going to teach Jesus. We're just going to teach Jesus, and eventually people come to know the Lord, and they will accept Christ through that process. I personally, I can appreciate that, but I'm just going to be on a soapbox for a minute, being in the culture and being in the crosshairs of what we deal with, and dealing with Christian kids, and dealing with members of your congregation. I can tell you that they're getting their theology on these issues not from you as leaders and church pastors, but they're getting it from the news. They're getting it from public schools. And I would so much rather that they get their theology on these public concerns from you and from our churches. Because our kids are confused. And you hear, there's kids in Christian churches and Christian schools all over the place that are coming out of it, and they're still confused with gender issues, because even there, they don't necessarily address some of the substantive issues. So
Yeah.
she's going to be on a panel speaking tonight at this thing at Reliance Church. Reliance Church is here in Temecula. If you guys are able to come, there's...
It's sold out.
Oh,
You've had to pre-register.
Well, it wasn't even charged, it was just, right?
Yes, I mean, it's sold out and
there's no more
it's a free
room.
event, but they're booked
Oh,
to capacity.
Is there no way that a parent, you know, in the old days, it used to be, if you didn't want your child to see this, you just sign it.
Mm-hmm.
You can't do that anymore?
Yes, so that's what I was gonna get to next. You can opt out in sex ed class, but what's happening is that these topics are being ingrained in history, in math even, in language arts, where the books that they're reading are, you know, I have two moms. You know, some people have a mom and a dad, some people have two moms, some people have two dads. Or, you know, I look like a boy and my parents guessed that I was a boy, but really I'm a girl, I'm a princess boy. And so these are books in in the library of the school, being read in language arts class. In history, the FAIR Act, which was passed in 2011, but only is now coming into play because it's the new time for adoption of textbooks, The FAIR Act states that history books have to affirmatively recognize the contributions of the LGBTQ community. And so within history books, you have Gavin Newsom, in a 4th grade history book. Gavin Newsom there, and it's all about his sexual orientation and how he was a hero for marrying 2 men and 2 women, despite the law at that time being that you couldn't do that. And so you can't opt out of those courses, or there's no mandate that you can opt out, or you're given advance notice as a parent. Your kid's just gonna come home and say, hey, mom and dad, look, I learned about this, in history or language arts. But in the sex ed class, by law, you are supposed to receive notice and the option to opt out. It's no active opt-in where you have to sign a permission slip, but you have to opt out, you have to, in writing, opt your children out, or they're going to be subjected to this. So if you happen to not see the permission slip, or your child doesn't take it into school, they lose it, they're going to be subjected to this.
Can I interject one more thing? There is a concerted effort, not only at the state legislature, but locally here, where there have been some secret meetings that we've had people at who are representatives of all the school districts. You think, oh, we're in Temecula, Marietta, Menifee,
Yes.
for those of you who live around here, we're in conservative school districts. Wrong. You're not. They send people to this conference where they have hidden 2 transgender individuals coming, talking about how they are going to implement all of this curriculum and how they are going to do it without the parents knowing. Okay? That's in our most conservative school districts in the entire state, frankly. We've got Christians on our school boards. We have Christian superintendents who are saying, no, we're not teaching that, when in fact they are teaching that. Either they don't know or they're lying, I hate to say it.
If they get some kind of tax credit or something like this, does the school get some kind of?
There's the potential that they can be punished by not receiving tax dollars if they don't teach the state's curriculum.
Okay, so there you go.
So anyways, one of the reasons why we're bringing this, one of the reasons why I put this on the list of things to address. You might be looking at this saying, well, wait a minute, we're a church. We're not, that doesn't really affect us.
But it does.
It does, and you are the answer to parents like me who have children but need the option to not subject them to pornographic material. I can't even sit here and talk about it. Bob had to say it because, it's intentional infliction of emotional distress. That even in a workplace, if you talked about these things, you said what Bob said to a coworker, that's sexual harassment. Yet our young children in mixed company are being subjected to this. And so we have no other option but homeschool or private schools and churches who have schools. So you are the answer.
We don't have children. Is it very costly to go to private school? I just don't know. Going to public school, I guess, just costs nothing. So is it just, can you give me a number, ballpark? What does it cost to send your child to private school?
Terry, you want to answer that?
10 grand.
10 grand a year.
Per child per year? Okay.
There's a lot of the organizations, like, we do provide financial support to the extent that we can. But, again, we have same issues any other business has, or we have salaries and buildings and insurance, and so,
So maybe churches could consider is supporting.
But our high school is right now about
Scholarships.
12
Right,
for our high
right.
school and 10 for our elementary.
The saddest thing that probably ever happened to me after speaking at an event on these issues was when a single mom came up to me and with tears in her eyes said, what am I going to do? I can't afford to put my kids in private school, I don't have the money. And I can't homeschool because I have to work to support my family.
Yeah.
And that's honestly where I look at the church and I just, the church has to come together and say, we've got to put something together to save our kids. What is it going to be? Is it retired teachers who are coming together and going to, homeschool, help kids be homeschooled, where tuition is not, where they can afford to do it, I don't know. but it's one of these things where it just seems like something has to happen. The church has to take the bull by the horns on this in California, because it is such an overwhelming big issue. I wish I knew a guy who ran a number of churches in like a few states. Just kidding. Sorry, Glenn, put you on the spot. Yes?
You know, I'm wondering, because I also audit charter schools, but what the flexibility for a charter to deviate from the traditional district curriculum would be. And I mean, I know a lot about them, but this one issue now with this new law, I don't know how much flex capacity they have to do that, because then you have a tuition-free school that can deviate.
Right. Publicly funded charter schools are subjected to the California Healthy Youth Act. When it comes to sex ed, they have to teach this. So, you know, the first law that was passed wasn't applicable to charter schools, and then there was a new bill that applied this to charter schools. And then when we look at trends, what's next? Because there's always the next step and the next increment that they're going to try to push. And so we have to be aware of, you know, if it comes to homeschool, and right now we have the option of homeschool and private school without having to teach this. But if they make it a graduation requirement, that is going to be an issue. And it seems like, oh no, you know, that's not going to happen. But let's talk again in a few years and see where we're at.
Some way we can argue, you know, like rights, you know, something like that.
Yeah.
Is it not harassment?
Not
You might
harassment,
say,
just basic
my child is
rights.
being harassed by listening to the stuff you described, can that not be an argument you can use in court or no?
Yeah,
Is that just, yeah,
so unfortunately, our Constitution, there's no constitutional protection against stupid laws.
Oh,
Right.
Our Constitution does not talk about parental rights. So the cases from years and years ago about parental rights are not very strong. And in California, they're very weak. And so it's very difficult to go in and argue this is a parental rights issue when the state says, no, we have an overriding public concern, public interest concern. And so the parental rights arguments are weak. They're not strong. And the Constitution doesn't come against some of these crazy idiotic laws. And so you're left with some difficult situation. And so one of the areas that, you know, we've talked about how we can strategize to fight back is, okay, maybe we don't have the ability to say constitutionally you cannot teach, you know, this LGBT XYZ stuff, 10 genders. But what we can do is we can bring lawsuits for sexual harassment on behalf of kids and families whose kids have been subjected to that. And I'm going around asking, you know, offering that up. Do y'all ever hear of anybody who says, my kid sat through this pornographic stuff, and we'll say, okay, well, let us know if that's a family that's willing to allow us to bring a lawsuit for sexual harassment. I'll be the next Gloria Allred for kids in public school.
Right.
We will. She actually never will be. I'm trying to retire.
All right, so the next thing is gender issues. We've covered a lot of it, but one thing is the gender neutral bathroom bill in 2016. Some of you might have questions. Does that apply to churches? Does that apply to our nonprofit ministry? And currently the answer is no, that it does not apply. So federal law prohibits employers from requiring employees to use bathrooms associated with their birth gender. So you can't say, you know, if you're a public employer, a for-profit business, you can't say, well, you're a male, biologically you've used the male bathroom. But when it comes to religious schools and churches, there is an exception. So the Department of Fair Employment and Housing offers an exception. Like Bob said, gender identity and sexual orientation is a protected class federally, but the exception is still applicable to churches. And so we currently, you don't need to do that. Anything you want to add there?
No, but that is definitely an issue for churches. You know, you're going to be faced with it. Individuals coming, and one of the most important things, John gave a presentation on on crisis management. But what's probably the best thing you learned out of that is be prepared in advance for the potential for a crisis when they come. This is a crisis, so be prepared when someone who is transgendered comes, and it's a male who comes in and is dressed up like a female and goes into the women's restroom. What are you going to do? Legally, do you have the right to tell them you're not allowed in here? I think you do. Physically and, policy-wise, what are you going to do? And case in point, flying home from the same-sex marriage from San Francisco after arguing some of the same-sex marriage cases back in '04, I think it was, and I'm sitting next to somebody, and they say, "Oh my gosh, here's what happened at my church." It was Valentine's weekend when all these same-sex marriage licenses were being issued. And a pastor, as a lot of churches do, say, we want to recognize all of those of you who have been married the longest, and stand up and sit down. If this one was, okay, the newly married people, stand up. Sit down if you've been married less than 5 years, or stand up, less than 5, less than 3, less than 2, less than a week, and who's left standing? A same-sex couple who just recently got married in San Francisco. And the ushers were like, they didn't know what to do, and everyone's kind of, and they go and they give them the gift. And at that point in time, people got up and walked out of the church. Now, that pastor just they didn't know what to do. They weren't prepared to think about these issues. So how do you deal with issues like this? And for churches, I think that a lot of the problems it's just not being prepared ahead of time for the sexual issues, you name the cultural issues, things that are hitting us. It's not just the sexual issues, but there's other things you just be prepared for in advance.
All right. So you're actually the next three. Is the free exercise clause still alive and well?
Yeah.
Along with that, is there a constitutional right of conscience?
Yeah.
And the trends in the Supreme Court?
Yeah, okay, so we'll hit all this pretty quick because we've only got, we're supposed to be done here in about 2 minutes. The free exercise clause, it was really watered down in years past unfortunately, by Justice Scalia in a decision that he rendered. Not intentionally, but he did. Watered it down. I think if he had the opportunity to go back and realize what he wrote, he would probably try to fix it today. But it was too late. And so years have gone by, and when we have cases where free exercise of religion has been challenged, a lot of times what we have to do is we have to bring it as another First Amendment type case, like a free speech case, a freedom of association case, these kinds of things in order, because the free exercise clause has been so watered down, I won't bore you with the details. However, thankfully, our Supreme Court recently ruled in the cake baker case. Jack, I forget what Jack's last name is. Anyways, Jack, neat guy. I was at a conference with him, we talked, and he says, you know what, I didn't want to, I served these two gentlemen for like 10 years. They came to my bakery all the time. I sold them cupcakes and bakery goods, and there was never an issue until they asked me to design a wedding cake for them. And I said, I'm sorry, but I can't do that. And here's a guy, just gentle, neat guy. And anyways, he said he ended up losing hundreds of thousands of dollars as a result. Lost part of his business and stopped doing wedding cakes. But the Supreme Court came along and said, no, there is a right of conscience. And that cake baker cannot be forced to violate his conscience. 10 years earlier, I had a case in California in 2007, roughly, where two lesbian women were together. One wanted to be artificially inseminated. Two physicians were sued because they said, well, we're Christians and we will help you. There's a less invasive in vitro method, and we don't really have to engage, we just prescribe, and you can go try to get pregnant. If that doesn't work, we'll have to send you to someone else if we have to go in uterine, where we actually have to invade you physically, implant a fertilized egg. If it gets to that point, that violates our conscience, we can't do that. The California Supreme Court said, at that point in time, California Supreme Court said, those two physicians, their religious liberty is trumped by California's non-discrimination laws, the public accommodation laws. So that was the law for a good 10 years. Now, there's a good question. Okay, the Supreme Court ruled in the cake baker case, but we have the exact contradictory of the case in California. Which one is actually going to prevail? And arguably, the right of conscience under the First Amendment articulated in the cake baker case will trump. But we haven't had that case of recent here in California to deal with. So some of this stuff is just kind of, as a church, do you have the right to have your free exercise of religion and do what you want to do? Generally, yes. You generally do. However, people often say, well, wait a minute, these laws shouldn't apply to us. There's no exemption, but you say, well, they shouldn't apply to us because we're a church. That's where this free exercise question comes in. And the first question the court asks is, well, is it neutral and generally applicable to everybody? Let's say, for example, let's say you open a bookstore, and there's a ban on the Bible. That's not too far off. We had a potential situation last year that we were able to avoid, where there was the potential, based upon the wording, it would have banned the Bible, but probably wouldn't have actually been enforced that way. Well, let's just say there's a ban on the Bible. You have a church bookstore. What would happen in that situation? Is the law generally applicable to everybody? Yes. Because it's generally applicable to everybody, then the U.S. Supreme Court has said, well, the free exercise clause doesn't apply to protect you then. So, anyways, big questions in regard to the free exercise and these issues. The good news is the Ninth Circuit is changing. We have 4 judges that have recently been appointed that are conservative, that will protect our religious liberty. We recently had a case where we actually got 8 judges on our side out of 25 that are presently on the bench. Shocking. There are another 3 or 4 appointments to be made that are pending in Congress right now. The U.S. Supreme Court, the likelihood is, we might get another appointment who is a conservative, hopefully a Christian, on the court. The courts are changing, and hopefully we're going to find more protection. It's very exciting, actually. The churches are going to find, greater protection. That's some of the good news, I would say. Meanwhile, our state legislature is doing everything they can to pass laws to make it difficult on churches, and we're going to be fighting and dealing with those things.
Yeah. The last one that we haven't covered is counseling individuals with LGBT concerns. California was the first state to pass a ban against counseling, and that applied to licensed therapists. It prevented licensed therapists from counseling children, minors under 18, when it comes to issues of sexual orientation and gender identity. Now a therapist can counsel them, affirming them and help them to transition their gender or to explore their sexual orientation, but you cannot counsel against same-sex attraction. And then after California passed that, 18 other states passed similar laws. Licensed therapists cannot counsel minors. In 2017, a California legislator tried passing a law, AB 2943, which would have applied to all counselors. There was no exception for religious ministers, for unlicensed counselors, and that would have applied to adults as well. Fortunately, due to the pushback from pastors and from everyone in California, all the conservatives, the bill was pulled at the last minute. But the legislator who wrote that bill said that he would write another bill, but he wanted to work with the faith community. So that's not gonna go away, and we might see that roar its head again in the future. But for now, you are allowed to have biblical counseling. If someone in your congregation or at your school says, hey, I'm struggling with this issue, you can help walk them through that. But you keep your eyes out for potential laws in the future that would prohibit you